All right. Welcome everyone for our April meeting of Dallas DFW front-end developers. These are the organizers of this meetup. Uni, Christine, she's not here, Satya, Sangeeta, Kevin, and Razib is here. So if you have any questions or any suggestions the way we run the meetup or about the logistics or food, please give us your feedback. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Thomson Reuters, for providing this awesome facility and food for these meetups, and Manning Publications for giving us 2 e-book coupons every month. And this month we have another sponsor, the organizers of MVP Mix. We get 1 MVP Mix conference ticket. So at the end of the talk, we have a raffle. In case if you don't have the ticket, please grab one, and we'll get these door prizes at the end, like $25 Amazon gift cards, 2 ebook vouchers from Manning Publication, and 1 ticket for the MVP Mix conference, which is happening in May.
I have a second ticket.
Maybe next month. All right, we have Jonathan Curran, our speaker. Without much ado, I'll give it over to Jonathan.
Okay. Do you want me to use this, or
No.
Okay, I'm not going to use this then.
Yeah.
I think I got it. All right. Can you all hear me back there? Good. Super. All right. Close that. All right. So you're here to. I'm here, and you all are here to sort of learn about Mithril. The tagline's there. You saw it online. I'm not going to say it, so I'll just leave it at that. That's my email address down there. You'll see it again later at the end of the slide. So if you have questions, comments, feel free to reach out to me. I'm pretty good about responding to emails from non-work stuff, so yeah. I do some of these things, or actually most of all of these things. I quite enjoy speaking. I enjoy developing also, and I like coaching. I've been doing a mix of both over the last year or so, and I've really enjoyed it. The last few years, I think about 3 or 4 years, I've been valuing this concept of simplicity a lot more as I've learned to do a lot more and more complicated systems. My first real job threw me right in the middle of Struts 1. That was chaos. It was just so much to learn coming from having done web forms in .NET land and then jumping into Struts and like, okay, model view controller is fine, but the amount of boilerplate you have to do is just through the roof. And so now you look at these frameworks that have come out in the last 3 or 4 years. You've got JAX-RS even, which is maybe like 6 or 7 years old. Things are just much simpler, right? You can declare things, you can get it working really quickly. The more and more I find that in software, the more and more I enjoy using it, because reading it, which is the most important thing, becomes a lot easier. You have to wrap your head around things. If it's complicated, it's harder to do that. So my whole little motto for the last few years has been, don't introduce complexity unless you absolutely are sure that you're going to need that. So in that spirit of things, I'm here tonight to talk about Mithril. So Mithril is just an MVC framework for the client-side JavaScript stuff. It's small, it's lightweight, and because it's small, it's pretty much got about 20 functions. That's kind of about it. You can keep it all in your head. It's very simple. It's about 2,000 lines of code, including comments. It's about 1,800 or so if you believe the GitHub code line count. So if you want to read it in about an afternoon, you can, and understand the entire thing. It doesn't require you to watch a whole lot of videos, egghead tutorials, other people talk about it. You can just go read the documentation. You'll figure it out pretty easily. Because it's got a small API, it has a small learning curve. Again, simplicity, small stuff, I appreciate that. So resonates with me here. And it is pretty robust for the 2,000 line of code that it has. It's got everything you need to kind of build a spa. The biggest part I find is the componentization aspect of it. Sort of Mithril kind of allows you to build components, nest them within each other, more or less infinitely, which is pretty cool. Componentization is sort of the holy grail of software development. ever since, at least I can remember in like VB4, you grabbed like a third-party OCX and drag it on your form, and all of a sudden you had a different API to work with, and that was magical. So anyway, so it includes routing requests and, like I mentioned, components. It plays well with others. It doesn't require you to buy into the entire framework. If you want to use it alongside other things, you can. And nothing preventing you from doing that. And it's actually third-party integration is quite nice. So if you want to use it with other frameworks even on the same page, you absolutely can. And you can nest it in scope and say, hey, only take care of this DOM element, everything underneath, and that's what it'll do. And it's blazingly fast. It's actually fast because it does virtual DOM diffs as well, in the same vein as React does, for instance, and also Cycle.js and maybe like one or two other libraries out there that do that. Virtual DOM diffs is sort of a relatively new kind of thing in the last, I want to say, couple of years. But it has proven very useful.
Define what a virtual DOM is.
Virtual DOM is basically just that. It's not the actual DOM. The actual DOM is what you manipulate on the page. The virtual DOM is an object representation of it in memory, basically. So I'll show you examples of how Mithril, what it creates and what it views as the virtual DOM. I'll get to that in a bit. Here are some numbers. Numbers are cool, but ultimately not that important to me personally. Like I said, I value how easy the software is to work with. I value what it brings to the table. The numbers are just a big bonus on top of it. It is faster than React. I'm not going to say much more than that. It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. So, like I said, this is what I value. And so on with that. The agenda for tonight is going to be pretty straightforward. We'll cover Hello World, and we'll rocket on from there. We'll cover sort of the event system, how Mithril uses that to sort of allow you to do componentization. We'll do components, and then we'll cover requests, and we'll cover routing. All this in about an hour, so it should be all right. If you all have questions, feel free to interrupt me. It's very important that we all understand these concepts as I present them, because the further I get along, if you don't ask questions, the more lost you're going to be. So please stop me.
So I got one question before you start.
Sure.
And just to let you know, I may have to leave early.
That's fine, yeah.
But, I mean, one of the things that scares me about, and I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but
Mithril, yeah, something, yeah, sure.
Is that you look at the activity on GitHub.
Yeah.
There hadn't been any
No.
in a long time.
Well, it's two parts to it, right? There's two branches. There's one stable one which has been out for like 9 months or so, and no one's touched it.
Right.
Because it's fine. Right? There's no feature requests, there's nothing, it's
But
just...
you know what the definition of complete software is, right? Obsolete. So,
I honestly have no problem with that. Like I said, it's 2,000 lines of code. One person on your team can pick it up. It doesn't take a team of people to pick up the software. You know, what happens when this whole fiasco we've seen with Angular 1 and 2 and stuff like that, it scared people to hell in a high water. You know, everyone's like, wow, that's unexpected. You know, granted, Angular 1.4 will still be supported for the next 3 years or so, but how many people do you think are still going to stay on there?
nobody.
Or you would hope, but that's where consulting companies make their money. Right? So it is a balancing act. When it comes to software, you know, once things are feature complete, I find myself in that the way of thinking what you're describing a couple of years ago, and I was like, I've been working with Haskell a lot in the last year or so, more so in the last 3 months than anything else. And there are a lot of libraries in their package management system that haven't been touched in about 3-4 years. Although everybody recommends them to use that because they're like, yeah, there's nothing to fix there. There's nothing to add. It works just like it is. It's going to stay there. It's stable. We're not going to touch it. If you want to build something on top of it, feel free to modify and release a new component. So when people are able to say that they've achieved this particular point, that's a big deal. So anyway, back to Mithril. There's a stable version which has been out for a long time. It's like version 0.23. 0.2, the branch has sort of been running for a couple of years. They are working on a next branch, so that's where the activity is, on the next branch. So take a look at that. If you want to, how do you say, see how active the community is, just join their Gitter channel. Pretty much people are there constantly posting stuff left and right. It's actually one of the very helpful communities out there, I've found. And I quite like the people who run it and the people who are on that particular channel. Yes?
What was the name of that community?
Gitter, if you go to their GitHub website for Mithril, there's a link on there to a chat channel, and you can just click it and you'll pop you in the web browser, and you can just chat with people on there.
Oh, Gitter channel?
Gitter. Here, I'll just show you right quick. This is the Mithril GitHub page. Down here, there's this little tag called Gitter. And if you click that, you'll be dropped into a chat channel with a whole bunch of people talking about stuff. So if you want to look at community activity, this is a pretty good place to look at it. Look for it, rather. So I'll leave that there. Any other things before we get started? Awesome. So that's my goal for tonight. I want you to say, okay, that is simple. I understand that. I'd like to go at least try that out. That's what I'm hoping for. If I don't reach that by the end of the night, tell me, please. Because otherwise I haven't done my job of being here and letting you know about this. All right, without further ado, let's get started, and I'm just going to drop into code. That's it. The first example, I just kind of want to gauge everyone's sort of JavaScript experience. Is everyone sort of familiar with the concept of closures and the concept of this keyword in JavaScript? All right. So if we're good, anyone who isn't? Perfect. So I'm going to skip all this then. All right. I want to show you sort of what a minimal component in Mithril looks like. And I'm going to be using ES6 syntax just because it just saves me not having to read everything, which is great. I'll just execute this, and then we can go from there. So Mithril, the way the entry point into the system is this function called mount. So what mount takes is it takes a DOM element, and it takes something as a Mithril version of a component. It just takes 2 parameters. All the component is an object. I'm just going to put stuff here. It's not going to work, but that's okay. Is a view function, right, that returns some Mithril related things, and possibly a controller function. But you don't have to provide the controller. You can, if all you're doing is displaying something like a dialog box, for instance, that doesn't require anything, or an information panel that you have to select a programmatically style or programmatically display some input in, you can just provide a view function. That's all it does. Or that's all it requires, rather. If I end up going back and forth in my editor a little bit, please excuse me. When I plugged this in on this laptop, for some reason the keys weren't working properly, so just bear with me on that front. Okay, everyone get that? It's just a view function over there, and that returns, hey, here's an H1, put some text inside of it. That's what it does. I'll show you what that Mithril function there looks like, or what it returns, rather. Remember, you asked a question about the virtual DOM, right? What is it? What does it look like? Just take a look right quick. So in my editor, I built in some eval stuff in there. Anyway, so that's what it shows you over here. So this part down here is what the virtual DOM in Mithril sort of looks like. The first parameters, you see how I took an H1, it translates down into a tag, what the HTML tag is supposed to be. Attributes, I haven't touched that yet, but children is basically an array of what's underneath this. So it's similar to a representation of what an actual DOM.
It's a big tree.
It's a DOM tree. Yeah, it's just a tree. It's just an object of things. You can also do some cool stuff in it. If you all are familiar with the Jade sort of templating language in the Node.js environment, you can pass in some selectors inside here. So for instance, you could do, you can pass in a CSS style selector, and you can pass in an attribute selector as well. So I'll just do something hokey here, like that. And that gets rendered down to this down here, which is, hey, there's an H1, it's got it's got an attribute called style, which values color red, and the class name is foo and var. So you can inline stuff pretty easily. You don't have to be super verbose about it. You can if you want to.
It doesn't automatically, it's not using J in the back.
No, sorry, I just screwed up my environment right now, because thank you, editor. I'll just put this over here. Ideally you shouldn't be inlining styles, but every now and then it's perfectly fine. One of the actual funny, little slightly tangential thing, if you want to prevent developers on your team from inlining styles, take a look at content security policy, and in there you can say, don't render inline styles. And at that point, your web page will just blow up, at least in Chrome and Firefox. IE doesn't care. IE is like, hey, I'll just do whatever.
Developers just ignore the stuff.
Sorry, IE just ignores everything. It's just like, yeah, I don't care. Or Chrome and Firefox will complain loudly if you look in developer console. It's like, hey, I didn't render that because it's an inline style. Anyway, so yeah, you can specify an inline over here, or if you pass in a second parameter, in which now there are 3 parameters, you can specify an object in here, and you can say, the color is blue, or you can pass in a bunch of other attributes, HTML attributes, get mapped basically over there. All right, any questions? Good. So here's sort of what a fully fledged, quote unquote, component looks like. Like I mentioned, the component rather, can have a controller instance inside of it, and all it requires is a controller and a view. So over here, I'm just saying, this controller, I'm creating a new person, which is the person up there, and then I'm calling, hey, give me the full name of that, and return that inside this h1. So when I go mount this object, it goes and just renders that, right? Pretty straightforward controller and view, and quote unquote model as well, which is up top there. So I lied a little when I said that this is sort of a fully fledged component. Mithril can take some, in your controller, you have the capability, rather, of defining options and additional arguments. And I'll show you just in a second. Let me type this part out. So what that means is, what this enables you to do is sort of to externalize where your inputs come from. So for instance, let's say, let's do ops dot. So now it's expecting some key in the options to be first name and last name. And the way you can kind of pass that over here to Mithril is say, crap. Sorry, this is frustrating.
You just undid what you did.
I undid what I did. Yeah, that's okay. And so you can pass in parameters from the outside. Places where this would be useful, for instance, is if you're saying loading a page and you already have JSON from the server, you stick it in a variable in your HTML page and you're like, hey, the component, just fetch it from the existing JSON object. So when you're just rendering stuff for the first time, that's very useful there. And as we'll see, I introduced this little component keyword over here. This is how you can sort of parameterize your components. You can say, hey, here's a component, pass this data into it. So the first argument to the component is always going to be an object. Second, third one over, remember I added the args in there? You pass those like that. So typically, I guess the author of Mithril, when he sort of came from jQuery sort of background, then kind of went to Angular, and then kind of went to Mithril, which is fine, right? So the rationale behind that is typically components, at least in jQuery land plugins, they always take a object to do configuration. And then typically any arguments that are fixed come afterwards. So it's sort of the same thing. If you want to configure your object, pass in the data inside this object, your component rather, pass in the data to the object, and then kind of take it from there and go.
You're creating a component to basically you're creating a class then.
It's not a class because it's just an object.
Okay, create an object with these parameters, and that's what your component is.
Yeah.
Then where are your 2 arguments? What are you doing with that?
Right now I'm not doing anything, but they would go at the end over here. arg1, arg2, and then it's also available in your view as well if you need to access them there. Right, so the options only go to the controller, but the arguments go to the view as well. So you can use that if you're passing in fixed data, say from your component, you want to pass it to the view as well, without passing it through the controller.
Coming in through CTRL, is that what the idea is?
Yes. The first argument is the controller. So, first argument to the view is the controller.
Where did that come from?
Mithril takes care of that. So I did not mention that. Sorry, I should have. So yeah, when you give it a controller, Mithril instantiates the controller and then passes it to your view. And from there, you can do whatever you need to. In fact, if you want to, you don't actually have to use a controller. If you want to have an architecture, say, similar to what like Redux or Flux is, you can take the view inside of it, ignore all these. I did it again. Oops. You can actually ignore the controller and pull it from your global state. So if you want to architect your application like that, you can. It's just personally, I don't do that because I like my components to be all-inclusive. So that it's an entire unit of its own, then I can just pass it somewhere else and just have it work without relying on any external sources. That's just my personal preference. Other people do use Mithril in the Redux capacity as well. So it's just up to however you want to architect your app. It gives you a little flexibility there.
They would use Mithril instead of React in that?
Yeah, because React is just sort of the view part of it, right?
Right.
So if you want to take Mithril's view and integrate that with something else, there's nothing stopping you there. But there are a few caveats we'll get to, I'll show you, because once Mithril is no longer in control of the eventing system, then you have to tell Mithril when to go redraw itself. So I'll get to that in a little bit. So are we good with sort of the option passing inside the controllers and all that? Perfect. So I really hope I don't screw up on this slide, because I'll have to type a bunch of stuff out. What I want to show you in this slide is sort of the event interaction in Mithril, how you kind of structure that. So the goal is, we've got these two text boxes. The first one should represent the last name, or the first name, and the second one should represent the last name. Anytime we key up on it, we should change that. So if you want to look at it in sort of the data binding sense, you can, although this is not data binding. But basically what we want to have happen is we want data from our controller to pass through the view, and then anytime something in the view changes, we want to go back to our model, which happens to be currently in the controller. So let's see how we can do that. So we already have this input here. We'll pass it inside, we'll add an attribute to it, so Mithril knows to do some DOM stuff with it. We'll just say on key up. Let me create a little shorter syntax. On key up, I want you to do controller person dot first name equals event target value. I'm doing this a long way just to kind of show you how you normally do stuff anyway, and then we'll slowly carve up and take it down to how Mithril would like you to do things, although you don't have to. And we'll also add an initial value, which should just be controller person dot first name. I'm going to do this just for the first name, just because it's literally copy paste for the last name. It's not going to be any different. So you'll see that now the input box up there has the default value, and as I change it, it goes and changes the view as well. All right. So how Mithril sort of works in the eventing system and when it knows to draw things, is when you mention this little on key up, for instance, right? It knows that, hey, this is going to be a DOM eventing function. So what Mithril does is it goes and executes your function handler whenever that's supposed to be happening. And at the end of that, once it's run the function handler, then it goes and tries to redraw your view. Once it does that, it takes a diff against the actual DOM and says, okay, has something changed? If so, then okay, let me just change the pieces that are changed. So it selectively just re-renders parts of the DOM via that mechanism. And that mechanism is also hooked into request animation frame. So if you are making a massive amount of changes, your changes in the DOM are going to be smooth. They're not going to be janky. So that's just a big plus there.
Is it where they're building the DOM first and comparing against the DOM?
Yeah, and they're keying that, synchronizing that with request animation frame.
What if somebody had mentioned earlier, like integrating a third-party component or a library like D3 or something?
Right.
You know, they want to naturally access the DOM directly.
Correct.
So now what?
So what you can do, and I'll show you that towards the end, is in Mithril you can actually, in this attribute space here, there's something called a config object. And that's pretty much a function that takes a couple of parameters, and one of them is the DOM element itself. So when your view gets called, you have access to the actual rendered DOM. So then you can pass that to whatever function needs to handle that internal, the actual DOM itself. So it allows you to sort of have an escape hatch when you need it. So there's that. So, if we're doing stuff like this, where we're doing event target value, then we might as well just write jQuery. Why would you have this stuff, right? And especially if you're doing things in the raw sort of vanilla JS style, when it comes to testing, that becomes a bigger deal because now you have to import some DOM eventing faking mechanism and then mock that out and deal with all that stuff. Personally, the less work I have to do, the better. Therefore, Mithril actually provides some nice handy utilities, which it mocks itself for testing. And what that looks like is, before I get there, I just want to mention that this onKeyUp event, right? It's just a function handler, right? So it just takes a function. So we can't swap that out with our own function to do whatever it is we need to do, kind of like how we have it here. But Mithril sort of has this thing called with attribute. What with attribute does is it takes the first parameter, which is it's going to pull that off the event. So basically, it's going to do event target dot. For instance, in this case, it's going to do value. And then the second parameter is what should I do with this? Right. So in this instance, it sort of becomes similar to. Let's change that. It sort of becomes like that.
Just a shorter syntax for the same thing.
It's slightly shorter, right? So that gets us one step closer to removing boilerplate, but it's still there, right? We haven't really changed too much. We have gotten rid of the event system, which we're abstracting over with this with attribute function. But what could we do? Right, the second parameter is a function in which the value gets passed into. Now, if that was actually a function that we didn't have to specify in here, then what would that look like? Say if it was a getter or setter that we could just pass it into and access the data there, that would look like this. Well, I'm going to change that actually. I'm just going to say controller person dot first name. If I could just do that, that would be great. And so you can, in Mithril land of things, you can make the first name over here a property. The property is just a getter and setter, but it's a function now. It's no longer just an attribute.
So you can now pass it in.
So you can now pass it in. But when you access it, you have to remember to call it as a function. Everywhere, yeah. So I haven't done that here, which is why it's showing that function definition. If I change that, now I do stuff and it changes, right?
So the mprop function basically creates a getter and a setter.
It creates a getter and a setter. Exactly. And so that allows you to sort of do function passing. And then you can just access data through that and have a lot less boilerplate lying around. The less I have to look at, the less I have to read, the better if there's not too many layers of abstraction. If there's too many, then nobody understands what's going on anyway. So
If you needed a more complicated getter or setter, you just write it.
you could just write it as yourself. Yeah, if you need to go interact with other services or you need to do other things, do validation, you can do all that. So yeah, if this needs to be duplicated for the last name, you could just copy paste that if you want, or a better way, abstract over it, create another function, parameterize it, and now you can pass in a property in there and just have it. Yes, just abstract over this set, this object over here. That's what you can do, because the only thing you would have to pass in at that point is just the attribute name, which would be controller person first name, controller person last name. Everyone good with that? You guys are wicked smart. I like that. So, what's a component sort of look like?
After we talk
Okay, yeah, I'll get to that sort of towards the end if that's okay. Mithril provides its own little mocking library that you can just drop in for it alongside the rest of your application. So it abstracts things like, it mocks out things like DOM system, the entire DOM creation system, abstracts or mocks out the request mechanisms, the routing mechanisms, and a lot of the ES5 stuff that still some test utilities don't have. So for instance, if you're using Phantom.js or Ghost.js or something and you're running your tests in these headless JavaScript WebKit environments, some of those still don't have that ES5 capability. So it provides all this basic stuff for you. So just kind of want to touch on components, right? I mentioned components. So this is a little spinner. It'll probably take you 5 seconds to figure out how it works. It's not particularly complicated. A little spinner just goes up and down. We've got our model. We've got two functions, go up, go down, increment, decrement. In our controller, we take an option. Hey, give us the option. This is the default value. And then just pass that value along to the spinner, right? So this value up here ends up being a property. And so over here, remember I said that if you want to parameterize over it, you want to pass in a different value, say, you could say value m.prop, 9. One too many, I think. Yep. So now the default value is 9, right? Just passing stuff in from somewhere else. That's all we're doing, abstracting over that. And so for this first button over here on the left side, we're saying, hey, when this gets clicked, call the decrement function. And for the second button, when that happens, the on-click happens, just call the increment function.
Wait a minute, why did you need to use mprop?
So I don't have to. I could just make this a regular variable, and up here I would change all this, if I did, to, this.value.minus. I would simply do that.
Could you have made this value equal mprop value?
Sure,
So
yeah.
it would become a getter and setter on
Yes, yes, you absolutely
can.
can.
Pass in a regular set setting value.
That works as well, yeah. That would be perfectly fine. And so down here you change all these to,
Probably if you
Just
were going
5.
to create an object as your model, you're not going to have anything that's not proper.
Right.
It's bad form.
Yeah. But there's a reason I'm doing this.
Okay.
So now we have this component here. We've done exactly what you said, made a simple property or simple value that we pass in, and that the model creates the property, the getter and setter. So I want to talk about how you take these two components and sort of have them interact with each other, right? That's important. Because, yeah, I can nest components all day, but if they can't talk to each other, what's the point? So that aspect creates this little adder. The spinner component is the same from our last slide, but in this case I've used a property instead of just the value. I could have done it the way you mentioned. Down here in this adder component, just create this controller. I said, hey, create this number, 1, which is property itself, and the second number, which is also a property itself. And in the view, I'm going to take the spinner component, I'm going to have 2 of them, and I'm going to pass one of them the first value, and the second one the second value. And then when I want to display it, I'm just going to add up the 2 numbers, the 2 properties. So this trivial sort of example is why I passed in the getters and setters themselves, because now I have access to them in this outside component. So now if I change things, things are visible here, right? This is a very simple way to kind of do chatter between components. I wouldn't recommend this in like a big application, but for small stuff, if you only have one component talking to only one other one, just go for it. It's not that big a deal. Ideally, if you're having multiple components and you're sending messages to maybe a whole set of children, for example, and maybe they propagate some data down further down, just use the observer pattern. Have an observer mix in, and whenever subscribe those children to wherever they need to get messages from, and just execute them. It's the simplest pattern there is. It's not particularly fun, but it works, right? Like you don't need a signaling system, you don't need a routing mechanism. I've seen far too many people fall into traps like that. And I'm like, okay, now you're sort of bringing the concept of like a message bus into the UI, and just don't do that because it's really hard to figure out where your stuff comes from. And especially if it breaks, then it's even a bigger deal. Anyway, any questions on this? Man, we're zipping through this. All right. Remember earlier I mentioned that, Mithril has this viewing mechanism and it has to figure out when to do virtual DOM diffing. Well, I mentioned that Mithril sort of...
It's not you, I gotta go.
No, it's
Thank you very
fine.
much.
All good, yeah. All right, I mentioned that, yeah, so when events happen, when you specify in your view as to, hey, on click on something happened, Mithril then knows, okay, I need to keep track of this, and when that triggering is done, then I need to go draw the view. But what happens when you've got external events? How do you let Mithril know, when to do it? So for this instance over here, I've got this ticker component. All the ticker does is it start counting up, and then you can pause it, basically, or stop it, and it'll just stop counting. Basically all that does, right? And I'm doing that via setting an interval. This is a complete BS example, but it points out the problem here. So when I click start, nothing happens, right? So see in the view over here, when I just said, hey, when this button gets clicked, call the controller on toggle, which over here just forwards it to the model. That's all this does. So basically what has happened here is the set interval gets picked up and it starts running every 50 milliseconds. But it's not a DOM event, right? It's just something that's happening in the background. You can imagine this sort of being a WebSocket that's getting data, something similar to that. And it's not redrawing, right? The reason is because, again, it's going outside of Mithril's sort of event system. And so the way you kind of tell Mithril to fix that is you just say, Mithril, hey, just go redraw yourself when those events happen outside of it, right? So now when I execute this, hit start, now it start counting up, right? That fixed the problem of where before it wasn't doing anything. So that's just to sort of show you that if you need to force Mithril to update itself when other events have happened, you just need to drop this one line there. That's whenever you're done getting your data, doing your whatever you need to do with that, then just call that from the external component. That's kind of about it. Questions?
Okay, question.
Yeah.
One of the things that Angular, says that separation of concepts, that you have a view in a separate file and then you have a controller
Yeah.
in a separate file.
Sure.
How does this one solve that? How is it a problem to start?
I don't think it's a problem to start with. You looked at React and company, and they do exactly just this. The reason I don't think it's a big deal, and there's a stark difference between Mithril, React versus sort of Angular. Right? Angular has its own templating system. It has its own definitions inside of it. Has its own logic. Has its own language inside this templating mechanism over here. Whereas React and Mithril both kind of just say, okay, you can use JavaScript because it's just functions. You just build your view and give it to us. We don't care how you do it. Here's some helper libraries. I mean, you don't have to use this M function over here. If you want to write your own sort of functions that create views for you, you're more than welcome to. Both of those technologies are very agnostic about that kind of thing. When it comes to separation of concerns, it's funny that any templating language, regardless on the server side or the client side, mentions that because the very fact that you're using a templating system is mixing concerns. Right? You're taking data from somewhere, you're plugging into this view mechanism, but now you can't really see what the contents of that data is. It's two separate systems, right? Like there's no way in a templating language when you look at this object to say what's inside this object. You already have to know. And so that to me is sort of breaking the concern in my mind because now I have to go look at two pieces of code and not in one place. So, yeah. If you can look at your entire component and data and functions that operate on that data in the same place, it's just easier to mentally figure that out instead of having to look at 2 or maybe 3 different places. That's all. And then JavaScript is already, how do you say it? I don't want to use the word challenging, but I think challenging best describes it sometimes. Having to think in another language outside of JavaScript, especially in a, you're already used to using if, else, and then. Now you have to learn something slightly different. You have to use ng repeat. You have to do all these separate things that are just slightly different. So that context switching is just not fun sometimes. All right, on to sort of requests. This example, what I'm going to do is just call this HTTP bin.org function and pull some data out of it, which gets you the current IP address. That's all that does. So I mentioned Mithril sort of has its own sort of request system, right? And the way you kind of invoke that is just via this m.request function. The internals of it look very similar to what jQuery has. You specify your method, your URL, the data that you want to pass to it. One thing that is different about how Mithril's request system works is that by default it expects a JSON interaction. Right? So you don't have to specify an application or content type to be application JSON all the time everywhere. By default, it just expects that. If you want to override that because you're getting HTML or plain text, then you can override that yourself, or if you're getting XML for some reason. This HTTP bin thing up here, I'm just pulling this object. Inside of it, there's an origin thing, which is the external IP. That's all that's displaying up there. Down here in this component, you'll see over here in this model, I've created a basic one with something called unknown. That's the initial value that I've plugged in there. And then, let me back up, sorry. So the request object in Mithril, what it returns to you is a promise, or something very, very, very similar to a promise. It is not 100% promise spec complete. It's about like 99.5% there. There are technical reasons for that 0.5% why it doesn't match up. If you want to read about that, you can on the Mithril API site. They explain it quite well. It simply has to do with expectations of when promises are fulfilled. They're slightly different in Mithril than they are actually in the promise spec. But for most intents and purposes, you just never see it, and there's nothing different for the most part. When you're using the library, you don't notice anything particularly different. So because it returns a promise, over here when we call HTTP GET, there's this then function afterwards, which takes the first parameter is simply the success function. The second parameter is simply the failure function, what's supposed to happen. Everyone good with that so far? Everyone's good with promises? Sweet. One thing I do want to point out is Mithril by default, when it does requests, when it does AJAX requests, it is synchronous. Everyone at this point should be gasping and saying, oh my God, that's terrible, right? Yeah, it is bad for a reason. There's a reason why Mithril has chosen to do a synchronous by default nature. The reason is, when you go create your component, right? Over here, I've specified this default value of unknown. If I hadn't specified that default value, and I just did, HTTP bin.get, remember I said it returns a promise, right? So in this case, I can just replace this. I can do this.model. So now that thing's empty. I get that. That's there. Fine. That's great. What's changed, right? So I said when Mithril gets this component, instantiates this component, any AJAX requests that are in there, it executes them synchronously. The reason it does that, and if you have code like this, is because what is the data supposed to be when you're first firing that mechanism? There is no default data. So Mithril just chooses not to display anything until your promise has been fulfilled from the request. The reason for that could be manifold, right? For instance, over here, if you, say, had, just pasting stuff here. But if you had like 4 or 5 different models, you're fetching data from a bunch of different places, what's the default value supposed to be? There is no default value. At that point, you have to determine as a developer saying, okay, I need to show a loading screen, or I need to do something. Right? That's the reason why Mithril does stuff synchronously, because if you want the async part of it, specify it, but then handle the part that isn't async. it doesn't do that for you by default over here. That's not to say that you can't do that, right? Like I said, Mithril sort of comes with sort of batteries included, if you will. Right, okay. This little example is going to fire some point. Bear with me a second. Okay, there we go. I'm going to refresh the page and do that again. This example I want to show you here, this http-bin.org thing, /delay, if you pass it some number, it's going to delay for n amount of seconds and then return, right? So, for instance, I'm going to execute this code now, and so there's nothing showing up here, right, by default. It takes about 3 seconds for that to show up because that's what I've set it to over here. So that kind of shows you the synchronous aspect of Mithril. When I go render a component, nothing happens because the data isn't there yet. So if you do want to make it available, you want to provide some default data, you can do it in the way that I mentioned earlier, where you instantiate your own model by default. For instance, when I had the unknown stuff in there, over here I had unknown up there. You can provide that default data yourself if that makes sense. Or you can have your request generate that request have that default data as well. Mithril does allow you to do async requests, which is not a problem. Thing is, when you do that by specifying background true, you have to provide what an initial value is from that request, right? So suppose you have two people writing an application. One person's dealing with the server side of things, just the interaction between the request and the data that comes back and massaging it. They can say, hey, okay, call this function, you get some data, but here's the initial value. If some other person has to deal with just doing the UI part of it, they don't have to be concerned about that. They can just kind of use the data as is, and then both of them can continue on their separate little ways. So you can provide data saying, saying, okay, I'm going to provide a little fetch function over here. Well, the default data is going to be something like fetching. So now it says fetching. When it resolves, what happens? Nothing happens, right? The reason nothing happens over here, even though you provide an initial value, when that request completed, Mithril doesn't know that it needs to show any data. Because at this point, if you've provided an initial set of data, you could still then be processing, right? You could still then be doing other requests based on data that you just got. You could be basically you could be firing off many other requests. At which point is Mithril supposed to say, okay, are you done with processing your data? Right? It doesn't make an opinion about that. And because it doesn't make an opinion about that, you then have to tell Mithril to go redraw itself. So in our simple little case here, we can just say, hey, when that promise is resolved, then go and redraw yourself. At that point, it will go do that. Right? Because sorry. Where'd it go? Sorry. Yeah, I'm very sorry about that. So at this point in the promise, you could be, calling other functions, you could be massaging your data, whatever it is that you're doing. At the end of that chain, then you want to redraw. So Mithril forces you to fix that hole, if you will. Does everyone understand the reasoning as to why Mithril doesn't redraw at the end of async requests? Sweet. All right. Last little example. So I've changed this to what I had before. We've got providing some initial data, and this menu request over here, what we're going to do is we're going to just fire off 4 requests, or 3 requests, and we're going to say, hey, while this thing, we'll just have a default message saying, okay, this is going to get some data, and then in our view function, we're going to map over the models and pull out their external IPs, right? So it's supposed to take 6 seconds max because over here the delay I'm multiplying by 2, so the first one should finish quickly, and the rest should complete 2 times n, or 2 times I. So right now, again, nothing's changing, right? The IPs aren't showing up there. The reason, again, is because I've created all these asynchronous promises, but I haven't told Mithril when to redraw itself. You know, depending on the use case, you could say, hey, when the second request is complete, then redraw it. For instance, if you have user profile data, as soon as that profile data comes in, hey, go show the image, go show this, go show that. But then if the rest of the data is still loading, you know, you're like, okay, I don't care when that shows up. It's okay if that shows up a little later. And at that point, when those are done, then you can tell Mithril to redraw again. But let's say you want Mithril to draw itself only when all the data is complete, right? The way you can kind of do that is Mithril provides this function called sync. And in sync, you pass it, the first parameter is basically just an array of promises that you pass to it. Now, sync itself returns a promise. So when it's done, you can say, hey, go redraw. What is this complaining about? Args is undefined. All right, it's not a big deal because I have backups. It's not 4 or 5 of them, it's just 2 of them. In this case, the first one completes, second one completes, and then at this point I'm saying, hey, Mithril sync, take this fast one, take this slow one, for instance, and when they finish, when they both finish, show all done, and then go ahead and redraw.
Do you have any way to, that's what they're making the call to server side to get the data stream call. Do you have any way to separate the sequence file?
Yeah, you can just put in another file.
And then get it like service?
Yeah, as long as if you want to call it a service, yeah, you can put it in the service. I typically just put it on my model. The way I've been kind of working the last year or so, I've had fat models, or rich models if you want to call them, and they're able to kind of go do whatever it is they need to do. But if you want to separate into a service that has multiple things in it, then yeah, you can. Mithril doesn't kind of make an opinion as to how you structure your thing. That, by some, is viewed as a bad thing. I had a chat last night with a guy from the Houston JS group. You know, he comes from an Angular background. He was telling me that, you know, the reason I like Angular is because it forces me into this structure. And if there's anybody who comes on the team, we have to teach them that structure, albeit it's not necessarily easy for a junior developer. But once that structure is there, it doesn't change. And so that to him is a benefit, and I can see that, right? If you want a rigid way of saying this is how it's going to be laid out going forward, then that's fine. If that's what the team's comfortable with, then use that. But if you want to architect it differently with this library or with many others that are out there in the JavaScript world, you know, feel free. But that freedom does come with responsibility. It's freedom, but you still have to maintain it, right? You still have to architect it correctly. You have to make sure that there's no dependencies in ways that, or if there are dependencies, you have to resolve them. They can't remain unresolved. So that part is there. Any questions on this sync stuff? You don't have to use m.sync. You can use Bluebird, you can use Q, you can use whatever other promise resolving library that's out there as well. So it's not necessary that you use this. All right, last example. Just going to show you the routing stuff, right? So this little example is a culmination of all these sort of components I've created so far in the examples I've shown you, and maybe some that are not. Up here we have this little nav bar. When we click on each little component, things should change, right? The components that are rendered are different. And they should all work. And up here, if you've been noticing in the URL bar, the URL has been changing. So I'm going to change it now, and you'll see that up there in the URL bar, that changes as well. And I'm just using the back and forth to kind of go back in history. So Mithril has 2 ways of supporting routing. One is hash-based, and the other one's HTML5 push state. The reason it supports both is because not all browsers, depending on, mostly mobile browsers, aren't quite all there in the history push state stuff. Especially so Android native browsers, not Chrome, but the native browsers that manufacturers ship. They're sort of halfway broken in JavaScript. Sometimes they don't even have ES5 implemented, so you kind of have to do all those fixes for you. But anyway, that's to say that Mithril allows you to kind of flip back and forth between the hash change event or the HTML5 push state. And you can mention that, you can configure that in Mithril, but by default, it doesn't, it defaults to HTML5 push state. The way you sort of get going with that is down here. Move that up a little bit. The entry point is this function called route. Route takes 3 parameters. The first one is the element onto which you're going to be mounting your application. The second one is the default route, and the third one is the list of routes, or the object of routes that it should handle. Over here, I'm just mapping 2 of them. I'm saying, hey, this is the default route, this application, map it to this application component. And the second one, you'll notice over here, I'm saying not only do this first one, but also the second one, where when you have a colon in front of a keyword, that's a parameter that you can access via Mithril inside your component. So if I typed app/foo, if I did Mithril, hey, give me what the component is for this route, or this component keyword, it would return foo to you. The way you access that is by calling m.route.param and just pulling that keyword out, basically. And so that'll give you what component this application's at currently. Up here, the components, I've just kind of did a key value mapping to the components I already have created, right? So it's nothing particular fancy. Over here, I'm just saying get the components that's specified by the component keyword. If not, default to hello component. In our view, I'm just drawing the nav up here, the list of links that you saw, these things up here. And the second one down here, I'm just drawing the component, whichever one is the current component in the controller. All right, nothing particularly fancy, but it gets the job done and it works, and more importantly. So that's pretty simple in terms of how do you handle componenting or components, and how do you integrate them with routes? It's fairly simple. One cool thing about Mithril and routes and components is that what you can do in some of your components, I'm just going to use this one over here just because I want to put it here. If your component has an unload method, Mithril will provide you an event when your component becomes unloaded in case you're using any kind of routing mechanism. And over here, if for whatever reason you're not finished with your component, for instance, say the user hasn't completed the form yet and they're leaving your route in your application, you can prevent default, call prevent default on that parameter, on the event parameter, and Mithril will stop and no longer swap your components. So that little nicety there is just that little bit of attention to detail that I like, because that's a common use case, but people tend to forget about that sometimes. But yeah, that's just something simple, and I like having that there, so that you can swap your routes, you can prevent stopping them if you want to. Yeah. Any questions on the routes? Cool. It's question time, but I want to touch on sort of the testing a little bit, not too much longer. If you check out the wiki on the Mithril page, there's quite a lot of good stuff on there. There are actually component libraries that are already built out, so if you want to use stuff like Bootstrap or Polymer-based things, there actually been folks have converted them into sort of the Mithril component system, and so you can just kind of go pick them up and use them if you want to. That's down here in under these collections, basically. And there's just a bunch of examples, things that you want to do, things that you shouldn't do. There's just lots of stuff out there. And if you want to look for a job that has Mithril stuff, they post stuff on there regularly. The helpers and extensions part is what I ended up looking at a lot, because it's sort of just provide a few basic wrappers. For instance, remember I mentioned the observable pattern and things like that. There's just stuff that's out there that's just pre-made. It's like a 15-line function. You just paste it, and you get a free observer mix-in. So, but that you can write your own. You can pull in stuff from wherever. That doesn't really matter. I don't have the top of my head where it is, but there is a nice little utility library for testing in which you can say, hey, Mithril, whatever your view is, whenever that view gets rendered, it provides this sort of mock DOM, if you will, and it forces Mithril to render into that fake DOM. But once it does that, you can use CSS selectors to query whether if elements are there in that fake DOM or not. So when you're testing things, if you want to do UI testing, it's perfect for that. Because then you don't actually have to have a web page. You don't have to have a browser running there. So you can test your events, you can test the UI, what's there, what isn't there, just with CSS selectors, which is quite useful when you're testing things. Like I mentioned, Mithril comes with a mocking library of its own that, and just so you can just kind of go grab that. It's under the test folder, I think. Maybe not. Maybe a single test folder. It's somewhere in here. I don't know. It's mentioned on the community guide. If you go to the Mithril website, there's a guide that kind of walks you through doing component systems, and the API is very, very well documented and full of examples everywhere. That's one of the reasons I actually started using it, because it had examples for everything in its documentation. It didn't refer you to a third-party site, didn't have to support on the community. Everything you need is in one place, and it's literally just 20 functions that you have to know about. You don't have to use all of them, but there's just 20 of them. That's it. That's the entire API. I've enjoyed using it in the last 6-7 months or so. Had a good time with it. The way I sort of structure my app is, the way I structure my app is I'm using this tool called Rollup. What Rollup does is if you write ES6 modules, it does tree shaking, which just means if there's dependencies that you're not using, it removes them from the code that gets generated. And so each component that I have in my application is its own file, is inside its own file. And then I use ES6 just to import stuff from left and right, pass it through Babel to Rollup, and we're good to go. Pretty straightforward. The framework is pretty simple. You can use parts of it if you want to, pick and choose, or you can use the entire thing. And if you just want little helper functions, I showed you a few of them, m.prop with attribute. They're just little event factor or function factories, if you will, abstracting over certain things. Any other questions? Because that's all I have.
From your experience, do you find any limitations? I mean, for any situation where you find a workaround, or is it complex?
That's a good point. So I mentioned last night also the presentation I did. Thankfully, I have not had to do any workarounds. That is nice because you don't have to work against the framework, which is just a nice thing. One of the trickier parts for me initially when I was using Mithril was I had to wrap my head around this componentization and figure out, okay, I want to do a modal dialog box. How the hell is that a component? Right? Because it takes up the entire page. It's now sticking in front of the user, and it needs to kind of go away. It needs to pop in and pop out. So I scratched my head on that a lot, actually. That, to me, was probably the toughest thing about getting any kind of integration in there. And once I realized how simple it was, I was like, okay, I don't know why it took me so long to do. And the way you do that is you just have a component on there, you just drop it in there, and you can use a property to say whether this thing is on or off. And whether it's on and off, you can just toggle the style on it. I don't know why I thought it had to be more complicated than that. Because typically, if you're using Bootstrap Modal, for instance, and let's say you're just using plain jQuery, you have to instantiate some JavaScript code every time you want to show the modal thing. And then you have to have helpers to kind of tear it down as well. And that happens every single time a user clicks a button or does some interaction. Well, you just don't need to do that, right? Because it's a virtual DOM, you can just leave it there and just set the style to don't show. And then when you do need to, set the properties and have the content be a few properties, like a title, description, names of the buttons, have those be properties and just toggle those as you need to. So sometimes thinking too much about the problem works against you. At least in my case, it did. Less thinking sometimes is not a bad thing.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Yeah, no worries.
So, it's time for the wrap. Thank you. So, everyone got